Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to whip it good.
Oh, you're so funny!
This is a 35th scale Mark A Whippet from Meng, with support from the Tank Museum, which the instructions tell us involves allowing Meng access to the real vehicle and reference materials. This kit is also part of their Tyrannosaurus series, whatever that means. Anyway, inside the box we find this chunk of hull. That's as good a name as any for it. It's moulded in a tan-coloured plastic, and it's very neat and crisp looking, with lots of rivets for those who like counting that kind of thing. There's also a bunch of other bits and pieces on a few sprues, and the same thing can be said about those. They're neat and crisp and have a lot of interesting bits of detail, with a lot of rivets and bolts and such. For me, that is a big part of the appeal of World War I era stuff. It can really be a lot of fun to paint and weather these kinds of things. I don't know if the details are 100% historically accurate. I'm no Whippet scientist after all, but it looks pretty good to me, and I'm sure having access to the real thing and all that documentation means they've probably put some effort into making it accurate. Something interesting about this kit is that there are flat armoured plates that should, in fact, not be flat, and you have to bend them into shape. I'd not seen that before, but more about that later. The kit does include a few more small details than I was initially anticipating, which isn't a problem, just an observation, and there isn't really anything so small that it might cause some frustration, except maybe the cable hooks that you can see on this sprue. Speaking of this sprue, it had one of the parts broken off of it, and if you looked at that part, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was just a bit of sprue and not an actual part. It is an internal part and you could get away without using it, but if you do find it loose in your box, maybe don't throw it away. I did also have a minor problem with the way the drive sprockets are attached to the sprue, but we'll talk about that later as well. The tracks are individual links, which for some might be a bit annoying. Not for me though, I quite like them, and the only problem I really have with them is that they're a bit time consuming. I think it's worth it though, they'll look a lot better than rubber band tracks would. You may have noticed that there's no photo etch in this kit. Believe it or not, that makes me happy. There is this cable though. It's not quite photo etch, but these things do have a tendency to be a bit annoying. I didn't really like the way this was tied up. It's got some kinks, and it is a little bit frayed in some places, but it wasn't too difficult to fix, and we'll see about that later too. Here's the decal sheet. It looks to me as though you get a couple more options than the painting and marking guide would suggest. It is kind of tempting to paint this as a German captured Whippet. Here's the instructions. There is a lot of text at the start. Having multiple languages does take up a lot of space, so I guess that's fine. The diagrams themselves are quite good. They're well laid out, and I don't remember there being anything too confusing or obscured by the angle of the images, which is often a problem. Very good. Very instructional. Here's the painting and marking guide I mentioned before. It's a separate piece of paper, and I guess really it's a bit more accurate to call this a marking guide. The tank is pretty much one solid colour, still it should be helpful. Okay, that's what's in the box. It's time to glue bits of plastic together. I start with the big chunk of hull. Seems as good a place as any, and it is what the instructions say to do. Onto it I glue this bit, which probably has a fancy name, but I don't know what it is. Above it goes this bit, which kind of hangs over the edge. Then, on either side of that assembly, I add these L-shaped lengths. I have no idea what they're for or what they're called, but they do have some convenient keying, so they're pretty easy to get into the right place. Here's one of those plates I mentioned that require bending. Before I do that though, I figured it was probably a good idea to add the extra detail-y bits to them, like this little retaining ring, I guess you might call it, which is for a ball mount for an MG, and this little box thing. You don't have to put these on now, they could be put on after bending the parts, if that's what you prefer. This plate also has a retaining ring part, and it seemed sensible to add that now as well. And here's the bending. Woo! There is an image in the instructions, but the part does also kind of show you how far to bend it. When the inner edges of where the part is thin to allow it to bend touch, you've got the correct angle. You can also test fit if you like. I hear that's a pretty good habit to have. To continue assembly of the crew compartment, I glue this wall part onto the smaller section I put the retaining ring on. This is a good, well-designed way to join the hull parts together, and I'm not really sure why they didn't just have all of the parts like this. It still lays flat on the sprue, and you don't have to bend anything. Anyway, I glue that assembly onto the bent section, which is pretty simple. While that bonds, I put another retaining ring onto this part, and then I glue this small triangular piece of armor into the roof part, which was surprisingly fiddly. I got it into place as neatly as I could, but it's not perfect. This kind of armor does seem like there should be some gaps, but it may need a bit of putty work later on. Moving on, I glue that roof part onto the wall assembly. It's not especially difficult, but because the bent parts do have a bit of flex to them, I would suggest gluing the roof together in sections. There's a small plate that goes on the underside of that assembly, which was a little bit fiddly to get lined up properly, but nothing too outrageous. This side part goes on next, and it goes on just about the same as all the other plates, pretty easily, though it did need a little bit of pressure in some areas. Next, drilling. This is only for one of the variants shown in the marking guide, and I've got no idea if this is relevant to the German captured version, for example, but I'm doing it anyway. You need the holes if you want to include this little vision port thing, which is easy enough to install once you've got the holes drilled. If you don't want this, you would obviously not drill the holes, and if you miss drilling the holes, like somebody I know might be prone to doing, you could just cut off the guide pins and eyeball it. The final MG retaining ring part goes on the back of this plate here. You could do these all at once, but for whatever reason, I chose not to, mostly because I was following the instructions for once. I then take those two parts, along with some other bits, and assemble the front of the fighting compartment. There's a few angles here, but the parts go together at those particular angles quite well. It is probably a good idea to let that bond for a bit, but the next step is to glue it into place on the fighting compartment assembly. While I wait for all of that to bond, I glue the whole bottom into place, and it pretty much just plops right into position. This little plate goes on the bottom here. There is a correct way around this should go, which I think I got. Then, the fighting compartment goes into place. I forgot to show myself actually positioning this, but it's pretty easy. I then add the final armoured plate to the top of the fighting compartment. I follow that with this hatch, which is presumably for the commander to pop up and have a look around. On this sloped plate, I add what I think is a handrail. It's some sort of a bracket or railing or something. The part is a bit shorter on one side, and that side sits on the raised part with the rivets. It still looks a little bit lopsided though. It's time to bend some more plates, this time for the pointy bit at the front of the hull. As before, the parts do show you when they're bent to the correct angle, but test fitting shouldn't really hurt anything. I then glue the box assembly together, which is pretty easy. It was at this point I realised that the part I'd found loose in the box wasn't just a bit of sprue. It's a piece of internal bracing for this box thing, whatever it is. I wouldn't say it's really necessary, but I did put one in anyway, just for funsies, and it should help you ensure that this assembly is nice and square. Once that's together, it goes onto the front of the hull nice and easy. There are some pretty obvious guides for it. It is probably a good idea to make sure that you're putting it on the right way up. That little round bump should be on top. I then add the exhaust mufflers and some little vent doodads on the side of the hull. Also, another bit that protrudes over where the tracks will be. Once again, the keying makes this easy. Those details are duplicated on the other side of the hull. Then I add some little grab rail things to the top of the hull. They're small, so they are a bit fiddly, but nothing too challenging. Now to arm the Whippet. There are 4 MGs in ball mounts, and it's a pretty simple thing to slide those mounts onto the MGs. Just try to make sure you've got it around the right way, which I assume I've done. Once they are all together, it's just a matter of putting them in their places, preferably the right way up. The glue will, of course, hold them, but the real things weren't held in by glue. There's a little ring that goes on the outside, so I add that. It would be silly not to. Having done all of that, I will say, with hindsight being 2020, it is probably a good idea to put these guns on last. They are not at all difficult to break. Ask me how I know. Moving on, it's a really good time for wheels. I start by assembling these return rollers. These actually have some keying, so once you line the parts up so the keying will engage, they slide together really easily. The road wheels come next. Some of them are like this. 2 simple parts that go together very easily. The other road wheels are also made up of 2 simple parts, except these have flanges. They're just as easy to put together. The idler wheels are made up of 3 parts. You insert this middle bit, which has keying, and then you put the outer wheelie bit on, or is it the inner bit? Either way, it's really simple. The drive sprockets required a little bit more work, mostly because the sprue gates are on the teeth, and that's kind of annoying. It's not really that hard to deal with. You can carefully clip the sprue gates off without causing too much damage to the teeth. Careful being the key word there. Unfortunately, the video here is a bit blurry, but it's not the most difficult thing. Just be careful and take your time with it. The drive assembly requires this chain part, which I think is pretty interesting, and it would be nice if it was visible when the model is finished. This pin goes through the large gear, and there's keying on this for one of the sprocket parts, so do be sure to put the correct sprocket on the correct part of the pin. And then this bit goes on the smaller sprocket. There is a correct way around for this, and you shouldn't have any trouble figuring out which way around that is. That assembly can then be installed on the track holding plate thing that probably has a technical name that everybody but old Herbert knows. A little nudging might be needed to make sure this is straight, but it's not too difficult. Same with the idler wheel. There's only one contact point for this, so it is a bit easier to get wonky, but just don't let it get wonky. Easy. I then install the road wheels. The two different kinds of wheel go on in a particular order. If you're building along with me, refer to the instructions. I'm pretty sure I got this right, but I am, believe it or not, prone to making mistakes.
Oh, nobody would believe that.
On the outside of this assembly, there's a track tension adjusting doodad. It's easy enough to put on, as long as you don't forget it like I almost did. The Whippet Track Tension Adjusting Society would never forgive me. Anyway, the other track side plate bit needs this mud chute part glued into place before we can join it to the rest of the track assembly. A bit of pressure, and bam, it's together. I then sandwich those two assemblies together. It's not the most difficult thing, though a couple of the bits didn't quite line up properly. I did a bit of kajiggering and some trimming, and eventually it went together. I'd left the return rollers off when doing this, having figured that putting them on before joining the two halves would probably lead to misalignments and make things more annoying, and I think that probably would have been the case, but it was also kind of annoying to put them in the way that I did. I had to trim down pretty much all of the axle nubs, and I did omit one of the rollers because it was never going to be visible once the tracks are together. The final part is this flat doodad, and it's pretty easy to get into the right position. Then I did that all over again to make the second running gear set. Now that those assemblies are together, why not glue them to the hull?
Well, I have no objections.
Good, let's continue. The keying is good and solid, and unless you're trying to put them on backwards or upside down, you shouldn't have any problems. It looks good, but there is still more stuff to add. This little rack, I guess you might call it, goes on the back here. If I was to do this again, I would probably not glue the central part of this. On the left rear of the fighting compartment, I add this tool, for tooling, I guess. And then, above that, what I think is the engine starting crank. I think I've glued this on the right way around. It was kind of hard to tell, but the other way had an overhang, so I thought this way made more sense. Here's what goes on that rack. Track spuds, which I think is just a fantastic and hilarious name. And until I built this kit, I don't think I'd heard that term before. Track spuds, as you might imagine, get put onto the tracks for extra traction in the mud, and they hang on this little rack thing at the rear when not in use. They just kind of clip on, though having glued the middle of the rack did make it a bit trickier to get them all on. There's another 8 that go on the right side here, and 2 more on the left. Then, the towing cable. I fixed the kinks and fraying by simply twisting the cable, easy enough. Then I cut the length the instructions say to cut. 190mm, though I would suggest making it a bit longer. The cable end parts are plastic, so to make them bond, we need superglue. I was kind of surprised by how easy it was to get these together. These can be a bit of a struggle sometimes. Still, I only really felt like making one cable, so we're just going to imagine that some no-good punk kid has either stolen or broken the other cable. Lousy punk kids. The cables are held onto the model with these tiny little hooks, which were one of the more fiddly parts of the build. It's probably a good idea to let them bond before trying to attach the cable. So, in the meantime, tracks. The most time-consuming part about these is cleaning them up. You need 68 links per side, and each link has 3 nubbins. That's 408 nubbins. They do go together fairly easily, though I will say some of the little clippy bits don't work, and they're fairly easy to pull apart again, which is pretty annoying. The drive sprockets were more in the way than anything, and they looked as though they were holding the tracks way too high, so I cut them back. Nobody's going to see them anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Initially, I thought I would just spend a couple of minutes to plop these into place, but no, they kept coming apart, which was very annoying. This was especially bad on the left side. For the right-hand side, I figured the way to do it was to start by gluing the upper run into place, so that it wouldn't just split apart and fall off while I was trying to manipulate the rest of the tracks and clipping them together to form a full run. So the tracks were a little bit frustrating, but they do look better than rubber band tracks would, in my humble yet correct opinion. The next kind of frustrating step is to attach the towing cable. Because the mounting hooks are rather delicate, I figured it was a good idea to add the cable slowly. First, I glue one plastic bit onto the hook, leave it for a moment to bond, and then I add the rest of the cable along the bottom, supergluing it into place. And then I glue the other plastic end into place. This is where I discovered that, despite cutting the cable to the correct length, it isn't long enough. Isn't that fantastic? I did manage to get it all into place, with a bit of bending and nudging and such, though the forward end of the cable doesn't really look that good. If you do happen to be building this kit, I would suggest cutting the cables maybe 5 or 10mm longer. I'm not super happy with the cable that is in place, and it doesn't really look that bad, but putting it on did reinforce my decision to only put one of them on. And looking at pictures of Whippets, you almost never see the towing cables anyway. I'm sure somebody will be upset about that, possibly a member of the Towing Cable Society, but I don't care. Anyway, that's it. The Mark A Whippet in 35th scale from Meng is now completed. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the model. It does look rather good, and now that I've had a bit of time and sat back and looked at it, I'm not so annoyed by the tracks and cable. I am still a bit annoyed with the right MG, and at this point it's probably pretty obvious that it's been broken and then fixed over and over again, mostly while trying to attach tracks and cables, and that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I would suggest putting them on last. The end result is pretty decent, and of course, parts that you're not happy with can always be covered in mud.
That's your solution for everything, Herbert. Just cover it in mud.
You got a better solution? It was an interesting kit to build. The armoured plates that needed bending were kind of odd, though not in a bad way, and I'm not quite sure why they would do it that way, but it has turned out pretty decent, and it didn't make anything more difficult or annoying, so no complaints from me. Maybe other Meng kits are like that too, I don't know. I think I've only built one other Meng kit. Maybe I should build more of them. I enjoyed this one, so why not? Off to the hobby shop I go. Maybe I'm starting to get a bit waffly. There isn't really a whole lot to say about the model that hasn't been said throughout the build, unless you want me to waffle about how cool I think the Whippet is. It certainly has a lot of interesting shapes and angles. It's very cool. Anyway, if you've got any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. It's pretty good for that. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this one live, I stream modelling a couple of times a week both here on YouTube and on Twitch. Twitch even has a schedule that you can check out. There's a link in the description. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of thing, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi if you're able. Links to those are in the description too. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.